All right, greeting aviators and aviation fans. This is Mike, the Chili Dog pilot. Hope you guys are all doing well. It's a nice Sunday afternoon. I figured I'd take the Archer up to go for a quick flight. I was going to practice some maneuvers, but I also wanted to kick off a series that I wanted to do in follow-up to a previous video I did on aircraft ownership. I'll have that link up here if I can figure out how to do that. But in that video, I kind of did high level all the costs that are associated with airplane ownership, to include your fixed costs, such as hangars, insurance, subscriptions to your databases, and then your variable costs that are primarily maintenance, and then your obviously hourly costs for fuel burn, oil changes, what have you. What I want to do now is go a little bit deeper into each of those elements, and I'm basically going to share my experiences. So I think the first caveat there is this is an N of one, and an N of one of a person who owns one airplane. I can share some other insights just based on being in the club. But what I want to focus in on primarily is my ownership as an airplane owner. And as I mentioned way back when, and I'll just remind you again, part of the reason I bought the Tomahawk was, one, to just have a little bit of that flexibility of flying, not relying on scheduling for the club, but two, is really to start to understand the elements of airplane ownership. And so that way, when I'm ready to purchase a larger, faster airplane, I kind of have at least some of that understood. And I certainly have had some lessons learned. So today we're going to focus on what I'll just call airplane storage, and that really comes into probably one of three options, or actually two options. One of those options has kind of a two different parts. So the first option really is the tie down, so tying down in a designated spot on the airfield outside. And then the second option is a hangar, and that could either be a solo hangar that you're renting, or possibly a community hangar at some of your larger airports where there may be an option to do that. At a high level, we could talk about each of those first, and then we'll talk about my experiences. I think it's just interesting because in the time that I've owned the Tomahawk, which has been since July of 22, I've been in four different hangars and a tie-down spot. And I kind of talk about my journey and some of the considerations that went into that. But at a high level, the tie-down is most often going to be the cheapest option for your airplane. It's going to be obviously tied down outside, so the trade-offs there is it's a low monthly cost, so if budget is an issue, that's something to consider. But the flip side of that is there's other considerations you need to have. So depending on your location, weather could be an issue. Especially for me, I'm in the Philadelphia area, so what we basically call the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic. So we get all four seasons, and snow and ice also becomes a consideration, as well as just the impact on the engine when you're trying to start an airplane that's cold. The other locations, like I said, I grew up in Arizona, so they had tie downs, but they were covered tie downs, so at least that way you had a little bit of protection from the elements, primarily the sun. And so obviously some of the challenges with the tie downs, against the fact that it's the most cost effective, is you're also dealing with Mother Nature. So this is where your pre-flight inspection also is looking out for birds, bugs that might try to start nesting in an airplane, especially if it doesn't fly frequently, or even in the wintertime when that is an option that gets them out of the elements as well. So those are things to consider on the tie-down side. And then obviously there's always severe weather that could also impact your hangar as well. Or, I'm sorry, impact your airplane as well. From a hangar perspective, I think there's probably the biggest difference with the hangar is, advantage with the hangar is a better protection from the elements. And I've seen hangars come in all varieties, for just being an enclosed location where you can put your airplane, to some that are climate controlled. And they also have a variety of options, like some come with and some are without electricity. So all things to consider when you're looking at the hangar situation. And then, like I said, there's two main types, right? There's the solo hangar, so that's basically most common is a T hangar that you have for yourself, and that is a place you put your airplane and potentially put your tools and other things that you want to maintain at your hangar to maintain or work on the airplane. And then there's community hangars, where it's a large hangar, you're sharing it with other pilots, you're divvying up the cost. Obviously, the downside with the shared hangar is you are not going to have the privacy. There's always the chance of some sort of hangar rash from planes moving in and out as they are getting ready to fly, and there's always a chance of somebody possibly touching or handling your aircraft when you're not around. But the biggest challenge with hangars right now is availability. I think I've seen online and just talking to people where there are folks who have basically been on wait lists for multiple years and still not have a hangar. So it can be a frustrating part, and I think it's one of the parts of aviation that if you're in the realm of purchasing an airplane, you need to start looking into and start getting on lists. So with all that being said, I'm going to talk to you briefly about my experiences when it came to what I did when I got the hangar. And quite frankly, I wasn't as well versed on all this when I first started, because like many, I just assumed I'd call up an airport and get a hangar. So so from a initial standpoint, as I was kind of zeroing in on which airplane I was going to purchase, I started calling all the airfields, and kind of the basis for my approach was this. I belonged to the flight club. The flight club was 30 minutes door to door from my house to the airport, so and that was at Northeast Philadelphia Airport. And within my house, I was kind of using that distance as kind of the initial basis for trying to find a hangar or tie down. So within 30 miles of my house, I had 5 airports available to me. I have 2 Class Deltas, so Northeast Philadelphia, that's KPNE, and Trenton Mercer, which is KTTN. KPNE, so Northeast Philly, is, like I said, 30 minutes from the house. It has a good mix of, single engine type GA flying, as well as some corporate aviation. And, there's, I think, 2 flight schools there. And so it's moderately busy. I would say it's relatively light for a Class Delta. In comparison, Trenton Mercer is a much busier Class D airport. So from that perspective, there's I think 2 flight schools there too, but there's definitely a large 141 flight school. At one point when I looked at them, I think they had upwards of 60 aircraft, primarily 172s, and then also a good number of multi-engine Senecas for training. And like I said, they had 60 aircraft, so they, I think, had partnership with one of the local colleges, as well as they were doing the transition program for Army rotary pilots getting into fixed wing. And that will come into play a little bit later when I talk about my journey. In addition to corporate flying, I know there was at least 1 or 2 businesses that maintain their corporate fleet there, Johnson & Johnson being one of them. And then there's also Part 121 traffic there too. So Frontier, has multiple flights daily out of there, and then Allegiant is now flying out of there, I think, 2 or 3 times a week. So very busy Class Delta. And then we had 3 uncontrolled airports within 30 minutes as well. And those were Doylestown in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, Princeton Airport, also in New Jersey, and then Trenton Robbinsville, which is on the east side of kind of that Trenton area. And so those are the options that I looked at. And so the approach I took was with all 3 of those, with all 5 of those, I called all the airports to find out a couple things. And the series ran into, what's their availability, which surprisingly, it was all waitlisted for hangars. And I think 1 or 2 might have even had waitlists for tie downs. It's been a few years, so I don't remember exactly. But that's also when I first learned about the whole community hangar approach as well. So in some cases, they were the same price or slightly less than an individual hangar. But again, the benefit is it keeps the airplane out of the weather, especially during the winter months. So, and then, their tie down rates. And then some required a contract, and others required a contract, but also, gave you 30 days ability to get out of the hangar. And then, depending, you could prorate it, but being that there's a wait list, most of those airports would waive the proration because, quite frankly, they'd get a person in the next day that you leave. So in reviewing all these things, as I said, my baseline was I was used to driving 30 minutes to go fly at the club, so that was kind of the point basis of which I was working with. I ultimately went with Doylestown Airport for a tie down. The 2 reasons was I think it was the cheapest of the tie downs at under $100. I think it was like $95 a month at the time. But also in talking to the airport manager, 2 things. They were probably the most responsive with trying to help someone find a hangar or tie down, and he was also basically stated that they had the quickest waitlist approvals. So I figured I'd roll my odds that way, and hopefully I could get into a hangar within, I think he was saying at that point in time is probably a year to 2 years on the wait list. And then he also explained the way their wait list works is if you're new to the airport, you're at the bottom of the list. If you are, and then the priority goes to existing residents. And I don't know if they differentiated between existing hangar residents or tie-down residents, but basically those got priority. And there might have been, it might be hangars first for upgrades to tie-downs to get into a hangar, but don't quote me on that because I don't recall. So I spent about 6 months at the tie-down, and one of the concerns I was starting to get is as winter was rolling in, was being exposed to the elements. It created two challenges. Number one, it was the obviously the exposure to ice and snow. Fortunately, we've had up until this year, we've had some pretty gentle winters, so that was less of a problem than I was anticipating. But it's also just, starting a super cold engine, especially an engine that's been cold soaked for, a couple days. So as luck would have it, is right as I was getting ready to start looking at like Bruce Custom Covers and some other places for like wing covers and tail covers, especially with the Tomahawk having a T-tail, I figured it'd be a lot easier to just remove that cover and shake off the snow and ice than try to get up there and ensure that it's clear. Then I'd have to figure out some way to have a hanger or a ladder at the tie-down spot so I can get up high enough to see, the clearance. So anyway, right around the end of December, I got a call from the airport saying that there was a hangar that was coming available. Basically, the resident there was moving to Princeton, and if I was interested, I could move in, and I could even move in, within a week, and just, kind of figure out with that current owner, some sort of proration with him since he already paid for the month. And it was obviously an easy decision, especially as winter was rolling in. So I moved into a hangar. Many of you guys, if you're watching these aviation videos, will know that hangar because that's actually the hangar that Russ is in now. So that obviously preludes the fact that I didn't stay in there indefinitely. But great hangar, great location, had pretty much everything you want in there. And I think at that point in time, the price might have been $450. In that neighborhood, I could be off, but that's kind of what I remember. And again, this was 3 years ago.
Okay, just want to jump in real quick to make a couple comments. So the first thing, as we look at this hangar, you'll notice it was a nice size hangar, but there was obviously some work that needed to be done. Primarily, one of the previous owners had put a lot of plastic up along the roof ceiling to kind of keep some of the birds out. Over time, that plastic has deteriorated, and as you can see, was in this state when I took over the hangar. I took some of it down, but clearly whoever had the hangar between me and Russ did a nice job of relining the entire hangar. So Russ certainly got a much better hangar than I, so congrats to that. But more importantly, what I wanted to talk about real quickly is I was giving you numbers and figures based on my best recollection, which clearly was not good. So I did throw some overlays on pricing, and then once we get into a later part of the video, I will also share with you the actual prices year over year at the different locations.
And so I was, pretty happy there. I liked the feel of Doylestown Airport. There was a lot of, it felt like a good community airport. I just learned recently that the airport's about to turn 100. So in 2028, it'll be 100 years as a private airport. So that I think is pretty cool too. But the one thing I noticed is at that point in time, I had the availability to basically fly at a minimum 3 times a week, and then sometimes even as much as 4 or 5 times a week. So I'd basically fly every Saturday, Sunday, and then during the week, depending on workload, I'd either get up super early, fly in the morning before I go to work, or in the evening after I was done with work. So let's just say on average it was 4 times a week. And so what that amounted to, from a time perspective, was 4 times a week with a half-hour to 40-minute drive each way, plus pre-flight and post-flight. I was adding 2 hours to every flight with all the just travel and prep work. So I managed to do that for about a year. And as I was thinking about just time and availability, I was trying to weigh in the cost of, is it better to be closer and spend a little more money, but save money on time. And what I was primarily doing was really looking at Trenton Mercer Airport, because door to door from that airport to my house was less than a 10-minute drive. So I could save a significant amount of hours over the course of a week. So rather than spending, let's just say 4 hours of travel time, I'd spend about 40 minutes of travel time. So that was a huge advantage. So I talked to Trenton Mercer about a year after being at Doylestown. They had several hangars available. They were a little bit pricier, so I think it was about a $250 delta between the hangar that I had at Doylestown to the one at Trenton. But I figured for that price, it was better wear and tear on me and my time. So I get some air going up there, try to keep it cool. Okay, so with respect to Trenton Mercer, I went ahead and moved to Trenton Mercer, and I think that actually on the surface seemed really well because, like I said, it was about 10 minutes door to door from hangar or from house to hangar, and then another 15 minutes, pre-flight on average, and 10-minute post-flight. So I was saving a significant amount of time. So that part was good. The part I wasn't expecting, and that ended up being a couple strikes. There were a couple strikes that then started to emerge in my time at Trenton Mercer. Probably number one was the impact of that large flight school. So when you're looking at a flight school with over 60 aircraft, they were keeping the airfield busy. And then you layer in the the business traffic, and then the airline traffic. It was not unusual for me to wait 15 to 20 minutes or more from startup to takeoff, and a lot of time just sitting there burning low lead on the taxiway waiting in sequence with upwards of 8 to 10 aircraft in front of me. And then on the back end, there were many times where I was waiting to come back and was basically asked to stay outside the Delta until they call me up and are ready to sequence me. So timing, a lot of times, you'd have to get the timing right to be able to start up and taxi and take off right away. I mean, it did happen at times, but when you're balancing availability with work and your time, it didn't always work out. So the only time that flying was really good out of Trenton was when the weathers were below what they were comfortable letting the students do. But other than that, I think it was overall probably the best hangar I had. It was a nice sized hangar. It was well equipped. I think so strike one was obviously the time savings was just transitioned from being a travel time to a taxi to takeoff time. So I wasn't gaining any time. So that started to become the first strike because I was spending money with the intent of saving time, and that wasn't happening. The second strike for me happened at one point. I had a fuel leak. And obviously I was looking to try to get an A&P or someone on the field to just take a quick look and help me assess it. And what I come to find out is there was no general aviation maintenance available on the field. What general aviation maintenance was there was obviously basically working for the flight school, and with 60 airplanes, they didn't have the ability to help out at all. The FBOs were all, biz jet focused, so they weren't able to help with their maintenance teams. Fortunately, I was able to get some help through an owner's club, and it ended up just being a worn gasket on the gasolator. So it was a quick fix, but it certainly opened my eyes up to this could be a challenge moving forward. And then the third thing was while I was at Trenton, I switched to a new job and a new company, and so when I was at my previous job, I had a company car, and so the car insurance was covered by the company. Signature, who was renting out the hangars, was demanding that all drivers on the airfield needed to have $1 million of liability in their car insurance. Which, for any of you, if you look at your car insurance, $1 million is pretty steep. Fortunately, that was the cover, or maybe it was $500,000. But either way, it was higher than what most people normally get for insurance liability. Fortunately, the company car and the company insurance had that amount, but when I left the company and was reverting back to my personal cars, the increase in insurance costs that go up to that high liability amount was pretty significant as well. So when you couple all three of those things together, it was no longer really worth the extra money to be in those hangars. So I went back to the drawing board. Fortunately, I was still on the waiting list for the other 3 airports that I had not been to yet, which was Robbinsville, Princeton, and Northeast Philly. And then I basically just called up Doylestown and let them know that I was also going to be looking to come back. And I explained the story to them. They were pretty sympathetic and understood. And as luck would have it, probably within 3 or 4 weeks of me calling Doylestown, I actually got a call from both Trenton, Robbinsville, and Doylestown that hangars were available. And so at that point, I just kind of sized up the opportunities. Ultimately, the Doylestown hangar was less expensive, even though it probably was not as nice as the Robbinsville um, hangar. But knowing that I've been on the waiting list at Robbinsville for almost 2 years at this point, it made more sense for me to go to Doylestown because I felt like there was definitely movement in their wait list, because obviously in the time that I've owned the Tomahawk, I've been in 2 different hangars there. So I moved into what was basically a pop-up hangar. So it was one of the ones that they put on the east side of the airfield. It was basically put together. It was just sitting on top of the existing tarmac, and then it did not have any electricity. So that was the only downside. And I think this was around the May-June time frame of about year and a half ago, or it's coming up on 2 years. So I moved into that new hangar, and that price, because of the elements of that hangar, I believe the price, it was less than the hangar I was in previously, what we'll call the Russ hangar. I think it was probably $375 a month for that hangar, and obviously they were discounting it because it was one of the smaller hangars they had, plus it did not have electricity. So I moved in, and then obviously I let them know, like, hey, please put me on the wait list. I know it's summertime now, but come wintertime, I would definitely like electricity to just be able to preheat the engine and whatnot. So I was put on the wait list. In the meantime, what I was researching and looking at with several of the other people who had airplanes in those pop-up hangars was they basically utilized those solar generators and solar panels to kind of provide power, and that's what they would do to do some quick reheat as well as have lights. So I was getting ready to get into all that. So I did purchase the electric generator. I had purchased some solar panels. They came damaged, and so I was returning them, and right around that same time I was notified, hey, we have yet another hangar that's available for you. This one has electricity. However, it's also, it's our oldest set of hangars, so it is much smaller than the others. The Tomahawk would be fine, but like an A36 or like a Lance would not fit in there because they're much shallower in depth than a lot of the other, than the standard T hangars.
So here's a quick look at the aerial view of the T hangars. The one with the writing on it is the one that I moved into, and that only has a depth of 30 feet, whereas the traditional T hangars have a depth closer to 36 to 37 feet.
The other thing with that hangar was there was only pavement down the center, so basically where the landing gear would go, there was no pavement throughout the hangar, so the rest of it was gravel. The nice thing with Doylestown, as I was talking to them, is, as a leasee of the hangar, I could do whatever I want. So if I wanted to pave it, that was at my cost. Obviously, if I leave, there's no advantage to me. I did the math. The hangar was actually relatively cheap because of its size. So I think it came out to like $230 a month, so outrageously cheap for a hangar. And as I did the math, I figured if I asphalted the whole hangar floor, quite frankly, it would the total cost to me would net out as the equal cost of being in the other hangar with no power after about 2 years. So I'm at the break-even point, or coming up on the break-even point for putting asphalt on the entire hangar. And so now we're in a situation where I got a hangar that's fully paved. The electricity is pay as you go, so basically all the folks who are in this hangar row, we split the electricity costs over a year, and one of the other residents is the guy who's in charge of that. So that's where I landed, and I think, given the Tomahawk, its size, its cost, and everything else, that's probably the hangar I will keep for it. I have no need to go to a bigger hangar with that airplane, and it serves its purpose. So in summary, I will share with you the different hangar costs, and ultimately where I landed was the additional 30 minute or the additional 20 minute each way on the commute was balanced by a cheaper hangar, maintenance on the field, and a lot of other things.
Okay, so before I get to the close, what I want to do is spend a few minutes to talk about my hangar costs through my time in owning this Tomahawk, starting in July of 2022, and then working up to today. And as I mentioned, I was in one tie-down spot and 4 different hangars. So for that first 6 months, I was at a tie-down at Doylestown Airport, which costed $98 per month. And then in December, I had the fortune of being able to move to a hangar. The initial cost of that was $430. And then as we move to May, basically the contract cycle at Doylestown goes from May to April. So every May we see a little bit of a price increase due to cost of living. So in May, I was there for one additional month, and that price went up to about $445. At the same time I was getting my panel updated, I went ahead and made the move to Trenton Mercer. And as I mentioned before, that's about a $200 increase to $650 a month. And I'll tell you, before I move, one little side note, I was talking to another pilot about a month or two ago. That rate at Trenton is now close to $1,000 per month. Um, as I mentioned, after being a little bit frustrated with the things at Trenton as far as just the amount of traffic, the ability to get in and out of the airport, and the lack of maintenance, I moved back to Doylestown. I only spent a month in that pop-up hangar, and that was $415. And then when the stars aligned, I was able to get into the current hangar that I'm in now, which started out at $240 per month, and currently the rate just went up this month to $255 a month. And two quick reminders about my current hangar. I did install the asphalt ground covering over the entire surface of the hangar. That cost $4,800, and when I looked at that price plus the hangar rate and subtracted across from the previous hangar at 415, I figured after 2 years that would have paid for itself, and then my true cost will come down to that $255 a month. The other cost of this hangar that's not included in that monthly fee is the electricity. This past year, the electrical bill was $65 for the entire year, and that was higher than normal, and I think a lot of that attributed to the cold weather we had and a lot of the pre-warm-ups. So I hope these numbers give you a nice viewpoint into what hangar life or hangar costs are for me as a pilot in the Northeast Philadelphia area. And with that, I'm going to say if you have any questions or any additional thoughts, please let me know. And then I'm going to go back to the video and close out this video.
Your first big fixed cost as an airplane owner is where you're going to store and maintain your airplane, and it's critical that you take the time to do that, and also realize you may have to adjust along the way, because like I said, with me, I was in 4 different hangars. The shortest one was only for like a month and a half or 2 months, but I found myself in a hangar that suits the airplane and the needs that I have for it. And then, down the road, if I were to look at another aircraft, I think, we will look, start this journey sooner. Worst case, I would put the Tomahawk out on the tie-down and the new airplane in the hangar, so long as it fits, until I could find, a more suitable hangar. But let me know, certainly let me know your experiences and your thoughts if you are an airplane owner and you've gone through this, because the challenges are, again, the wait lists are out there, and I think technically I'm still on the wait list at Princeton, because I've never, with wait lists, it's easier just to stay on those wait lists, because you never know when they'll open up, and then you can work through that. But I think besides the price, ultimately what I'd say is look at the environment in which the airport is situated, because things like traffic from training, maintenance availabilities, all those things are also factors that could impact your experience. So obviously dollars is a critical part of it, but it should not be the only thing that you're utilizing to determine whether an airfield is the hangar or tie-down situation is the best for you. I'm fortunate, like I said, I have 5 airports within 30 minutes. I probably have another 8 to 9 within an hour. So there's options, but obviously the closer it is to me, the better. But right now, 30 minutes seems to be that golden spot for good availability and whatnot. All right, so I will follow up with other series in the near future, and certainly like, subscribe, and comment back if there's other things you want to see specific to airplane ownership, and we'll go from there. So beyond all that, I hope you have a great day. As always, thanks for flying. Please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.